I never thought refusing yoga could become a full-blown emergency. But then, this is HOA Karen we're talking about. It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind that usually whispers, "Relax, enjoy your weekend." Yet instead, I was staring at a notice stuck on my front door. It wasn't a bill, a warning about weeds, or even a parking violation, no. This time, HOA, Karen had declared that all residents were required to attend her mandatory HOA yoga sessions. Every weekend, attendance compulsory, mats provided, compliance expected. I laughed at first. It sounded like a joke, but as I read the fine print, my smile faded. Skipping the sessions could apparently result in fines, community service hours, or other disciplinary actions, as per her interpretation of HOA authority. I rolled my eyes and tossed the paper aside. There was no way I was bowing to enforced yoga, even if she had the clipboard, the megaphone voice, and the HOA letterhead backing her. No sooner had I made up my mind than I heard a commotion outside. Through the glass, I saw Karen marching down the driveway. Yoga mat clutched under one arm, clipboard in the other, sunglasses perched high on her nose. Her gait screamed purpose. She had assumed the role of the self-appointed sheriff of wellness, and I was now a non-compliant citizen in her universe. I opened the door casually. "Morning," I said, voice steady. "I don't think I'll be joining today." Her expression hardened. "Excuse me?" she snapped, stepping closer. "You're required to participate. It's for your health and the community. The HOA mandates it." I raised my hands in mock surrender. "I appreciate your concern, but I am not a member of your personal wellness program." Calm, factual, firm. She froze for a split second, probably processing that her authoritarian yoga plan was not going to bend me into a downward dog. Then her phone appeared in her hand like a weapon. "Fine," she hissed. "I'm calling the police." I stared, slightly bemused. The idea that refusing yoga could involve law enforcement was absurd. Yet here we were. Karen started dictating into her phone, dramatic and loud. Neighbors glancing from porches and peeking over fences. It was performance art masquerading as authority. And somehow she expected compliance through intimidation. Within minutes, lights appeared down the street. The sirens weren't quiet. And Karen's satisfaction was palpable. She had called in backup to enforce the yoga mandate. Little did she know, the situation was about to go completely off script, and the story she thought she was writing would soon unravel in ways she couldn't imagine. The sound of sirens echoed down the quiet, suburban street as two police cruisers rounded the corner, lights flashing softly in the morning sun. Karen practically danced toward them, her clipboard held high like a victory flag, phone still pressed to her ear. The deputies slowed, scanning the scene carefully, their expressions a mix of professionalism and subtle curiosity. I stepped onto the driveway calmly, hands visible, projecting confidence without confrontation. Karen didn't waste a second. "This man refuses to comply with mandatory HOA yoga. He is in direct violation of community regulations," she shouted, pacing back and forth like a courtroom prosecutor. Her voice carried across the street, catching the attention of neighbors peeking from porches and front yards. One could almost see the mental image she was painting, a villainous recluse ignoring wellness laws, and she, the vigilant enforcer of downward dogs. I held up a folder of documents, neatly stacked, letting the evidence speak for itself. "I own this property," I said, voice steady. "I am not required to attend any yoga sessions. There are no legal obligations here, and the HOA cannot enforce personal wellness programs." I emphasized personal wellness programs, with deliberate clarity, hoping the words would register over the chaos Karen was creating. One of the deputies stepped closer, politely asking for clarification. Karen waved him off initially, insisting that verbal HOA mandates were sufficient, and that noncompliance was a threat to community health and safety. The deputies exchanged subtle looks, eyebrows raised, their body language saying they had heard stranger stories. But this was definitely a new level. I calmly walked through the boundaries of HOA authority, highlighting the difference between actual enforceable rules and Karen's overreach. I explained that yoga attendance could not legally be mandated, no fines could be levied for refusal, and her attempts to involve law enforcement were unfounded. Each fact landed like small weights in the room, quietly tilting the balance of credibility toward me. Karen's gestures grew frantic. She jabbed her finger toward the trailer and bins outside, as if physical objects could somehow prove the magnitude of my crime. Meanwhile, neighbors were subtly filming on their phones, capturing her increasingly desperate behavior. The contrast between my composed presence and her escalating panic was stark. The officers listened patiently, asking Karen pointed questions about the legality of her claims. With each question, her confidence visibly faltered. She had assumed that calling 911 would instantly bend reality in her favor, but instead, her bluff had been called. Her entitlement was on full display, and the deputies were not impressed. As I watched her struggle to regain control, I realized something crucial. Her next move, her reaction to the truth of my position, would determine whether this morning ended in humiliation or escalation. And Karen had no idea what was coming next. Karen's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and her voice, once sharp and commanding, was starting to waver. She had expected that calling the police would automatically validate her mandatory yoga authority. But the deputies weren't playing along. Their expressions were calm, professional, and unmistakably unimpressed. I remained steady, hands visible, posture relaxed, exuding the quiet authority she so desperately lacked. I decided it was time to make one critical revelation. Just so everyone's clear, I said, deliberately slow. I oversee this HOA's oversight agency. I monitor compliance, board actions, and enforcement procedures. In other words, I ensure that the HOA itself operates within the law. My tone was calm, almost casual, as if I were revealing the weather instead of dismantling her entire performance. Karen froze. The clipboard in her hands wobbled slightly. Her phone dropped unnoticed to the gravel. Her jaw slackened, eyes widening in shock. The neighbors, who had gathered to watch her, enforcement, suddenly realized the situation had shifted completely. Even the deputies raised eyebrows, momentarily exchanging a look that said, "Now this is interesting." She tried to recover, sputtering. I'm just trying to enforce community wellness. It's for everyone's benefit." Her gestures became frantic, hands waving toward the driveway, trailer, and supply bins as if sheer volume could force compliance. But no one was listening. The calm clarity of my explanation contrasted sharply with her chaotic, desperate performance. One of the deputies finally spoke, voice steady and authoritative. "Ma'am, filing false reports or trying to coerce residents into non-legal programs can have serious consequences. You need to step back." The words hit harder than any argument Karen could make. Her posture slumped slightly, the aura of control she had been clinging to unraveling in real time. I walked slowly toward my truck, checking the trailer latches and adjusting my folder. Movements deliberate and composed. Karen's gaze followed every action, searching for some loophole, some invisible lifeline. There wasn't one. The neighbors, phones raised, recorded her meltdown, capturing the entitled panic that had replaced her former confidence. It was the first time she truly understood that her performance of authority had failed. The person she had tried to intimidate, the non-compliant resident, was someone who literally oversaw the rules she thought she could enforce. That realization froze her completely, leaving her unable to articulate words or regain control. For the first time, her entitled, performative power became entirely transparent. She was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless in the face of calm, factual authority. The situation had tipped irreversibly, and Karen had no idea that her next actions would only cement her humiliation. The street had quieted, but the tension lingered like a low hum. Karen had retreated a few houses down, her SUV parked awkwardly at the curb, the clipboard still clutched tightly, though her movements were jittery and uncertain. I returned to my driveway and calmly checked the trailer and supply bins, ensuring everything was secure. The sun reflected off the lake in the distance, glinting through the pine trees, and yet the serenity of the morning contrasted sharply with the storm of entitlement that had just unfolded. Neighbors had begun to cautiously emerge from their homes. Some leaned over fences, phones raised to capture lingering moments. Others approached cautiously, curious but supportive. Conversations buzzed quietly. "Did you see that? She actually called the cops over yoga? I can't believe how calm he was." It was clear that Karen's performance had not gone unnoticed, and in fact, the spectacle had turned her authority into entertainment for anyone watching. I took a slow, measured breath, reflecting on the irony. Karen had intended to assert control, to intimidate, to enforce compliance through fear. Instead, every move she made, every gesture and every word had only exposed her overreach. The 911 call, meant to demonstrate her power, had instead documented her lack of authority, her entitlement, and her complete misunderstanding of HOA regulations. I organized my supplies methodically, placing each crate and bag exactly where it belonged, showing neighbors and myself that order, preparation, and calm were far more effective than shouting or false authority. As I worked, a few neighbors approached me cautiously, offering quiet congratulations, subtle acknowledgments of how well I handled the situation. Their support wasn't loud or performative. It was steady and real, a contrast to Karen's dramatic chaos. By mid-afternoon, the lake was serene, its surface reflecting a sky streaked with gold and orange. The contrast between the calm water and the storm of entitlement that had visited it earlier could not have been more stark. Karen's attempts to assert dominance had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly, leaving her exposed to the scrutiny of the entire neighborhood. I leaned against my truck, watching her from a distance. Her movements were hesitant, almost apologetic, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. The narrative had shifted. The story was no longer about me, refusing yoga or defying the HOA. It was about Karen's failed attempt at enforcement, about the spectacle of entitlement meeting reality. The lesson was clear. The loudest voice does not always carry authority, and aggression cannot substitute for preparation, calm and factual clarity. Karen's meltdown had become a permanent fixture in neighborhood memory, a reminder of what happens when someone mistakes volume for control. As I watched her struggle to regain control, I realized something crucial. Her next move, her reaction to the truth of my position, would determine whether this morning ended in humiliation or escalation, and Karen had no idea what was coming next. By the following day, the HOA board had called a formal meeting to address what they referred to as the yoga incident. I arrived, with my folder neatly organized, documents, emails, HOA regulations, and police reports all stacked and ready. The room was small but crowded. Board members sat at a long table. Neighbors lined the walls, some recording on their phones, others whispering quietly. Karen was at the front, stiff, clipboard on her lap, sunglasses perched high on her nose, attempting to radiate authority despite the obvious tension in her posture. She launched immediately into her narrative, dramatic and loud, recounting my refusal to attend her mandatory yoga sessions, emphasizing every perceived slight, exaggerating the threat of my defiance, and framing herself as a protector of community wellness. Her gestures were large and erratic, hands pointing toward imaginary dangers, as though sheer volume and motion could bend reality in her favor. I waited for my turn. When I finally spoke, I did so with calm authority, voice steady and deliberate. Step by step, I laid out the timeline, the arrival of the notice, her confrontation, the 911 call, the deputy's observations, and finally, the revelation of my oversight role within the HOA's oversight agency. Each point was supported with concrete evidence, documents, witness statements, and recordings of the interactions. Every exaggeration she had made was systematically dismantled. The contrast could not have been more striking. My calm, factual presentation versus her frantic, desperate interruptions. One board member asked pointed questions about the legality of mandating yoga attendance and the proper scope of HOA authority. Karen stammered, attempting vague defenses, but her explanations fell apart under scrutiny. Another board member reminded her that filing false reports or attempting to coerce residents into non-legal activities could carry liability for the HOA itself. Her face went pale, jaw slack, as the weight of reality pressed down. After careful deliberation, the board reached a decision. The notice against me was formally withdrawn. Karen's enforcement privileges were suspended pending review, and she was issued a formal warning regarding overreach and harassment. The neighbors quietly acknowledged the outcome, some nodding in approval, others sharing subtle smiles as they realized the entitled meltdown had been fully exposed. Exiting the boardroom, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. My property, my autonomy, and my peace had been preserved. Karen's attempts at intimidation had not only failed, but had been publicly documented as evidence of entitlement unchecked by authority. The story would ripple through the neighborhood for weeks, a lasting testament to what happens when aggression meets calm, composed, factual resistance. As I returned to my home, the lake glimmered peacefully in the distance, the sun reflecting off the water's surface. My yoga mats remained exactly where I had left them, unused, entirely optional. And the lesson was clear. Patience, preparation, and composure always triumph over drama, aggression, and misplaced authority. Karen's meltdown would be remembered, but my calm persistence ensured that the true story, the story of order, authority, and respect, would endure far longer.